Hi, this is Shane Morris, host of the Upstream podcast and a co-writer with John Stonestreet on Breakpoint. In our fast-paced culture, it can be difficult to slow down and take time to know how to cultivate our minds to love God. In his book, What Does It Mean to Be a Thoughtful Christian?, author David Dockery argues that Christians must be intentional about their thought life by following guidance from the Bible, listening to voices of the past, and engaging with the world. As a thank you for a gift of any amount to the Colson Center this month, we'll send you a copy of What Does It Mean to Be a Thoughtful Christian?, as well as access to a video series with teachers such as Elisa Childers and Kevin Van Hooser that'll help you translate thoughts into habits. Give today at colsoncenter.org/January. Welcome to Upstream, where we make your worldview bigger and older by taking hard questions to the headsprings of Christian wisdom. I'm Shane Morris. E pluribus unum is the motto of the United States, seen on our money, many of our government buildings, and even immortalized in a few movies, like The Wizard of Oz. It means, out of many, one. It's an expression of a reality that our nation is a union of 50 self-governing states, expanded from the original cohort of 13 colonies. But more importantly, it's an expression of an ideal or a founding myth, that out of this diversity, a strong unity can be forged, that what unites these states and the different ethnicities, religions, and political persuasions of the people who live in them is greater than what divides them. And what unites us? Well, Abraham Lincoln thought it was a commitment to self-government and equality. But in that very commitment that's supposed to unite us is the seed of ever-increasing diversity, which, if allowed to grow unchecked, can leave us with essentially nothing in common. This is a problem for the modern United States, divided and hyper-polarized as it is, but it's also a problem for the church. Both situations raise a question. How do we reconcile unity and diversity? Well, today I welcome someone who's written a very thoughtful book on that question. Richard Lints is Senior Consulting Theologian at Redeemer City to City in New York City. He was formerly Provost and Andrew Much Distinguished Professor of Theology at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary. His book is called Uncommon Unity: Wisdom for the Church in an Age of Division. And I welcome him to the show today to talk about that. Richard Lints, welcome to Upstream.
Thanks so much, Shane. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Appreciate you engaging here.
Well, we often hear this saying that diversity is our strength. And it's kind of the slogan of human resources departments everywhere. Big corporations like to talk about it, and they kind of use this very generic animation style on their websites to sort of get it across. You've got all these blue and pink and yellow people that are not real skin colors, but it's supposed to communicate this broadly corporate sense of diversity, that our identity and our strength is diversity. But I've always kind of wondered, is that true? Isn't there a certain point where we become so diverse as a people or a church or even a world that we can't sort of work together and do anything together anymore? Talk to us about that interplay and the idea that diversity is our strength.
Yeah, diversity means many different things to many different people. But whenever it's an end in its own right, divorced from any interest in or concept of union or unity, it becomes divisive. So there is this, what I've called a symbiotic relationship necessary to make sense of diversity and unity. So in earlier times and other places, you might have had a flat uniformity that was enforced by law. Our days are long past that. So we do celebrate diversity, but we celebrate it in part because historically there's been a glue that binds us together in the midst of our differences. And so when difference becomes its own end, danger lurks. Polarization inevitably follows. And I use the metaphor, as the Bible uses the metaphor frequently, of marriage. A marriage must account for the differences between the spouses, but a marriage that has no interest in unity and simply celebrating their differences doesn't last very long. And yet, not to take those differences seriously also will do great damage to a marriage.
This is one of those dichotomies that seems to depend on tension. So if you run to either extreme and sort of say, we're going to value just diversity or we're going to value just unity, you always end up with these serious pathologies that sort of destroys the whole project. So take the example of a family. And this is really interesting to me since I have 4 younger kids. If you're the kind of parent who says, we're only going to have unity in this household, you're going to end up like Captain Von Trapp in The Sound of Music. You're just blowing your whistle and have your kids all march in and matching uniforms like they're a military regiment. And you've kind of quashed their individuality and the virtues of their differentness that, Maria comes into the story and she brings out. And the captain sees how beautiful that is. But there's also another extreme. And I'm trying to think of a movie example. Can't really, maybe Cheaper by the Dozen or The Best Christmas Pageant Ever or something like that. But where the diversity of the members of the family is so great that chaos results, that they can't work together. It's like a Tower of Babel situation or even warfare between them. And so there's this tension. And I don't feel like we talk about this very much because the unity and diversity polls tend to break down roughly on like left and right ends of the political spectrum. So it seems like the left values diversity above all else, and the right kind of has a tendency to value unity above all else. But we're not valuing that tension between them. That's interesting to me.
Yeah, I think what the embrace of the political categories along this right and left spectrum as defining of life itself puts us in corners that we can't find our way out of. And so the questions are, how do we avoid those political categories as all-inclusive? And as you say, the tension, or what I call the symbiotic relationship, would suggest that woven into the creation is this reflection of a God who is 3 and mysteriously 1. And we don't negotiate at either end. It's not as if some of you accept the 3ness of God and some accept the 1ness of God. The Trinitarian character of the God we worship then is critical to how we understand the created order that he's made. And if that's the case, then there is a mystery, a tension, an inevitable aspiration that we hold these two realities together, unity and diversity. Now, as we know, a lot of it depends on the context. What context are you talking about, and how does it work itself out? There was a great movie, probably 15 years ago, called Crash, and it was about bumping into difference and the stereotypes that we place upon others that inevitably don't do justice to who people are. So it is, I think, when we crash into diversity plain and simple, we're stunned to recognize that these folks who seem so different from us actually, because of the fact that they are created in the image of God, have a lot in common. Now, it doesn't mean that we're all the same, but it is suggestive that this underlying unity of the created order, when it bumps into diversity, ought not be scared, but actually ought to think carefully, how does that difference impact that which we have in common? So it's no longer important or no longer tenable almost in polarized times like ours to speak about a common good. In every culture that has some vitality and stability, there is much conversation about the common good. And in a democracy, that common good emerges from below rather than from above, from a king, an empire, an emperor, on the list might go. So the challenge for us in a democracy, that context, that cultural context we live in now, is to recognize the influences it has on the way we think and the way we live. I've tried to make a case that the church historically, at least my reading of it, has wrestled much more with how is the church to be unified. I think that other side of that in a democratic age, small d, is how does it take advantage of the differences in the midst of our unity. And so I've tried to turn the question upside down than folks have historically thought about it. So a marriage that only thinks about unity and not about the complementary differences is in danger. So a church likewise.
I want to zoom back to the subject of the Trinity and the grounding in theology that you suggest for this kind of principle of unity and diversity. Of course, this is where theology and philosophy meet, because one of the great quandaries of the original philosophers in ancient Greece was this question of unity and diversity, the one and the many, the universals and particulars. Like, how do we reconcile these two things? And out of this tradition of reflection, we got a lot of weird, zany attempts to answer it, by saying that everything's made of air or whatever, but that the ultimate answer that came to possess the Western imagination was the answer of kind of Plato and then Aristotle. And it's that there really are universals and they have some relationship to the particulars. And I've heard it suggested that the Greek philosophical tradition is in many ways completed by the Christian gospel, by the idea that God is in one sense one, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. And in another sense, also three, that this is my beloved Son in whom I'm well pleased in the baptism of Jesus, and down comes the Holy Spirit. So you have these three persons showing up at once, acting in a sense independently, but in another sense as one God. This is an interesting suggestion. I know it's deep theological waters, but I've also heard it suggested that the very concept of love is itself possible because of the Trinitarian nature of ultimate reality. Could you sketch out a little bit more of the contours of that concept, that the Trinity itself, that God himself has in some way, with all the right qualifications theologically, unity and diversity within himself?
Yeah, the church is surely birthed into the midst of this great perennial issue about the one and the many. Early Christian reflection of a high theory nature. So one like Augustine or Origen are wrestling with the question, how does the gospel, this Trinitarian plan of redemption, relate to the Greek philosophical tradition, which wrestled with this question of universals and particulars between the one and the many? Augustine had that wonderful throwaway line, had Plato met Moses, he would have been a Hebrew. He was so close. I'm not so sure, but that's speculative. But on the other hand, it did suggest to Augustine and the early church's theological tradition that this Trinitarian conviction was in many ways the key to understanding everything, the whole of reality. Behind every bush, Augustine, here I'm using a different metaphor, would have found the Trinity. In every way, you have this complexity that belies unity and diversity held together, and that's critical. Now, the practical side of it in the early church, and I think in one sense for us, is that we are created as relational beings because God is relational. God is sufficient in himself, Father, Son, and Spirit, and yet he creates beings, human beings, that are not simply to be in relationship, but find their safety and significance outside of themselves. They are hardwired to move towards something besides themselves. And I think the recent philosophical turns to think about the ways in which the Trinitarian relations are reflected in human relations is helpful. I'm nervous about going too far there because I think there are mysteries we're trying to open the curtain behind which we cannot go. So I don't think that the social character of the Trinity is an exact replica of human relations. On the other hand, this relationship of love, and I would say it's cashed out in many ways, grace and generosity and compassion and mercy, all of which bind us together as God himself binds us to him. And so I think the upshot of this profound mystery, the Trinitarian mystery, works itself out in very concrete and incredibly important ways in the history of Christian reflection and in our own time.
As in so many things, I think C.S. Lewis does a great job of sort of walking this line. And there is a section in Miracles where he engages. He does this in a couple places, but there's a section in Miracles where he engages with the concepts and mysteries of classical theism. And he sort of makes the right, qualifications that we can't read creation back into God, but nevertheless, we can see that there is a reflection in creation of this fundamental idea of unity and diversity, of the one and many that is in God himself. And of course, one of the key qualifications is that in God, there's only one will because there's a shared nature. It's not like we have different persons with different wills in the Trinity. But that's getting into the weeds even more than we typically do on Upstream. I think the grounding there, though, is so key because it helps us to do more than just arbitrarily assert that there is a kind of tension that has to be maintained here, that we can't just run to the pole of unity, we can't just run to the pole of diversity, that in all of creation and in all of human relations, these two things are held in a sort of dance-like tension, that it's actually good for them to pull against each other, as it were, not so they can conquer one another, but so that they can actually fully be, fully expressed in human life. Now, here's a question that I wanted to get to because, well, I think it's really important. Modern people have this obsession with diversity, and we talk a big game about diversity. But then but ironically, when it comes to actually encountering diversity, we have this universalizing tendency. So I think of this, one of my favorite scenes from a childhood movie. It's called Milo and Otis. It's about a cat and a dog. All right. And at one point, the dog or the cat meets the dog for the first time when they're little. And he says, "You're a strange looking cat." And the dog says, "No, I'm not a cat. I'm a dog." And the cat says, "Okay, you're a dog, but deep down inside, we're all cats, right?" And the dog says, "No, deep down inside, I'm a dog." And it sounds to me like that's a lot like what Westerners often do. We'll meet other cultures, other people, other religions, and we'll just think, okay, you've got your trappings, but deep down inside, we're all secular, multicultural Westerners, right? And people have to say, no, we're not. What's going on there? Because it seems like that contradicts the Western obsession with diversity.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right, Shane, that you put your finger on it here. There is this almost paternalistic attitude towards those who are different from us, all the while affirming that we need to accept everybody as they are, whatever that might mean. And so there is, I think, a fundamental conflict between those two impulses. I think this is manifest globally today in the way modern secular folk think that the moral frameworks they have, however thin they are, must apply universally, though they have absolutely no grounds to apply anything universally. And yet there is this almost high-mindedness that they know better. And you have friends, I have friends around the globe in diverse cultures that just push back hard on this point. And I think that's exactly right. And inside our culture, it's hard to make the case that late secular morality is the end of the ladder we've been climbing and finally we've arrived. But there is that attitude in so many ways. Now, having said that, if I could wear a different hat here, I do think to our friends, the evangelicals, we need to find ways to communicate better with our secular neighbors and friends, co-workers, or new acquaintances, families, extended family members. How do you communicate across these significant differences about the nature of difference? That is a challenge. It's if we, to use Newbegin's language, we become missionaries in our own culture when we recognize that. And so how do missionaries act? They learn the language of the indigenous people. And we need to learn the language and really the moral intuitions, or maybe we should say the lack thereof, of our secular neighbors and friends. An enormous challenge, and in part what Upstream is all about, is recognizing how you engage these issues thoughtfully, gracefully, generously, and courageously with our secular neighbors.
There's something about the origin and function of humankind, or the structure of humankind, that you're getting at here that's very interesting. So you, in the book, you quote Lewis, where he says that humanity is actually more like a tree than a river, because the longer it grows, the further apart the branches get, instead of getting, joining up and becoming one. But we're out here on Upstream, and what we're doing is we're going upstream. And you notice what a river does as you go upstream is it actually gets further apart. The tributaries spread out, so it mimics the structure of a tree. I don't know where I'm going with that, but I just thought that was a cute little metaphor. But the humanity structure that you're painting here, you're saying this is good and designed, that there actually is something in that diversity, that Christians shouldn't be allergic to recognition of, okay, there are different cultures, there's different cultural contexts, there's going to be different languages, ways of expressing things, and all of those differences, political differences, all of those things have to be considered and weighed and taken into account as we, and this is the seminary term, but contextualize the gospel. As we evangelize, we have to do what Paul did, become all things to all men. And I'm anticipating, as we say this, and I want you to explain that, but I'm anticipating a sort of pushback from very conservative-minded folks that would say, no, all we need to do is just preach the gospel. And by preach the gospel, what they mean is say the same words in the same way as works in my cultural context. What's the danger they're worried about? And what's the pushback that you would have to that and say, no, we do have to contextualize?
Maybe a concrete analogy here. I meet a Japanese speaker on the streets of New York, and we're trying to communicate. My tendency, just intuitively, if I speak slowly and very loudly, I'm going to suppose he understands. I've got to learn his language if we're going to communicate, or vice versa. He has to learn my language. Unless you're willing to make the claim that there is one ideal language and I speak it, then the project of contextualization is inevitable. We all do it. We're not always all aware of it, but it's inevitable. And so I try to make a historical case. Many others have made. Tom Holland's wonderful book, Dominion, has made that case. The church looks different in different eras if we look back upon it. The church doesn't always look just like us. I opened the book with this experience I had in a little village in southern Zimbabwe, and the worship experience was something I thought was from another planet. But somehow you realize these are brothers and sisters, though they worship very differently. They live out their Christian faith very differently, and yet there is something mysteriously in common. And I make the case, it's that redemption we have in Christ, that it transcends our cultural differences, but doesn't obliterate our cultural differences. And so learning the language of our culture is imperative. And we have been slow to come to that realization, though I think we're making progress in certain circles, if you will. I think back the two classic texts about unity and diversity in the early church, 1 Corinthians 12, Ephesians 4, talk about differences in Trinitarian ways. But what's so interesting in both passages is the emphasis upon that which these differences actually have in common. They crescendo towards an affirmation of a one God, one Lord, one faith, one baptism, in the discussion about different gifts, in the discussion about, in Ephesians 4, different offices. So I think the New Testament is wrestling with an unmitigated diversity that is not restrained. Surely the early church was birthed in the midst of a deep polytheism of the Greco-Roman world, and they were very nervous about diversity becoming its own end. We live in a world obviously quite different than the first century, but many analogies, and others have drawn that conclusion as well. How do we relate to a deeply pluralistic, and in our instance, polarized world? Different because the Roman Empire exerted imperial control. We would like to have an emperor, I think, on occasion here in America, but the reality is we don't. But we still live in deeply pluralized times. And we, I think, have much to learn from the early church.
I loved that story out of Zimbabwe because, and we can use it as a reference point for another question I want to ask about differences that make a difference, as you put it. You know, this worship service you're describing lasted for 12 hours and people are just falling asleep throughout the night, and it's just sermon after sermon from preacher after preacher. And this is, you make the case, this is the kind of difference that we can actually embrace as Christians across cultures and say, that's a little weird. I want to go get my, my Sunday afternoon lunch, and I wouldn't be okay with the way they're doing it. But they do it that way, and Christ is honored by the way they're doing it. But, this gets to the heart of the book, which is, as I take it, this proposition that Christianity offers a way of looking at the tension between unity and diversity that the world can actually learn from and be redeemed by, that the church itself is meant to be an embodiment of the very principle that we're discussing, of that beautiful, dance-like tension. And it's important to contrast that, I think, before we move on, with what the modern world does with diversity, what the modern West, I should say, does with diversity. Because one of the things you do here is critique in a very creative and I think interesting way the modern concept of diversity. So you say that looking at someone and saying the African American community, or let's say the gay community, or white males, or just pick one of the categories that or people of color that are used by HR departments, and you say that actually flattens people out and tells a lie about them, because none of us is just one identity marker. We're actually a bunch of different identity markers, and modern diversity kind of inclusion training belies that. Could you tell us a little bit more about that critique?
Yeah, no, you're right. It lies in some ways at the heart of what I'm trying to get at in thoughtful ways, and retell the story from the vantage point of this strange redemption, where once we were excluded but now included. The language of inclusion is a big moral umbrella for modern secular folk without much content in it. So by suggesting that we embrace, or at least respect, differences, I think is exactly right. I want to affirm what we can affirm, and thereby find something in common. The reason we want to affirm difference where it comes is a certain kind of generosity of spirit. But in affirming diversity, we want to be careful that we don't, by doing it, stereotype people. Was on a faculty with a significant percentage of Hispanic colleagues, and they used to remind me that this great big umbrella called Hispanic Americans belies how radically different the Spanish-speaking world is in South America and in Latin America. But push back against the stereotype that would suggest anybody who speaks Spanish must be of fill in the blank. And so it is, I think, at every point in our history, our cultural history, we've been stereotyping others. But now, in a strange way, we actually affirm the stereotypes. David Hollinger talks about in this really interesting book on our cultural differences. David is at the different political sphere than I am. On the other hand, he captures nicely why we've gotten into the corner in talking about the 5 dominant stereotypes of our time. They emerge out of the census of 1970, and we begin to categorize those groupings. Now, I want to be careful. I don't want to suppose that there are some common experiences that bind diverse cultural stories together. But it's stereotyping to say everybody is just that way. Now, I think it's an inveterate part of the human fallenness, of the dysfunctions of our own heart to stereotype others. So it is not peculiar to modern secular cultural theorists to do that. I think we do that in every age. The outsider is always to be looked upon askance. And so here is the radical character of the gospel, that God says to those who exclude themselves by their own actions, he's going to include them by mercy and grace. So it is that we reflect that as we deal with differences also. So there is a way to embrace our differences without stereotypes. And I think it has to do with mercy and grace and generosity, all the cardinal virtues that come to us by virtue of the Christian faith.
I think it's a fantastic observation, and it gets to a tendency that I see very frequently in modern secular diversity, equity, and inclusion thinking, and that is that tendency to fall back on stereotypes. So we talk about the Pentagon of the 1970s census that categorizes people into one of these groups, like check the box, you're in. Well, we could also talk about things like the transgender movement, where on the one hand, we're affirming the fact that gender is some kind of social construct. It doesn't really exist. It's all stereotypes. But then in the very next breath, we say, if you like pink, you must actually be a girl, even though you were born a boy. If you like, guns and playing police and with model airplanes and stuff, then you must actually be a boy, even though you were born a girl. So it's like falling back on those stereotypes. There's this strange regressive character to much of progressive thought in these areas.
Yeah. And I think that's the challenge with much diversity training, is that more you emphasize diversity, the more you create the opportunity actually that diverse people aren't going to get along. There's so much now new literature on the harms that diversity training has done, that it's accomplished the very goal it was trying to avoid, namely categorizing people so that they can be excluded. That's a great danger. Now, I do think as those who are training to be missionaries in different parts, there is some cultural sensitivity training that it can be helpful. On the other hand, when it leads to the stereotyping of individuals, it's almost always dangerous. And so, whether it's the stereotyping according to race, according to gender, according to culture, according to language, according to education, according to fill in the blank, we don't do justice to this great climactic Christian claim that God creates us, all of us, with an eternal dignity. And we are to respect that. And when we bump into it, we ought not be afraid of it. And in part, that's the uniqueness of this Western experiment of human rights. And one could make a case that when we stereotype according to race, ethnicity, gender, we actually are denying the very moral framework of human rights that much of the West's moral history lied with.
So you're getting into a little bit of the capacity of the gospel in a missional context to appreciate and bring in diversity and then glorify that as part of, God's great project of bringing together people from every tribe, tongue, and nation, like we see at the end of the Bible. And yet there's this challenge that I mentioned at the beginning of the program that kind of parallels the challenge in the United States, where the diversity has become so great in a way that we no longer have a common story or recognize a common good. When you drive down the street in any major city in this country, and even in the kind of suburbs, you're going to see many different churches. There'll be the Methodist Church and the Presbyterian Church. Well, actually, there'll be several Methodist churches and several Presbyterian churches. And the differences between the different Presbyterian churches will be greater than the difference between a lot of the conservative Presbyterians and the Baptist, right? Because you got the conservatives and the liberals and the old main lines and so forth. And this presents an intuitive problem, I think, for most people. We look at that and we say, oh, okay, it's great. Diversity is a good thing, but surely there's a limit. Surely we can look at the visible division of Christianity in America and say, this is actually a problem. How can we, as the church, approach the world and say, we have the solution to this unity and diversity thing, if we ourselves look so radically divided and are not really talking to each other and are not really even sure who's on the team and who's not, because, well, some differences make a difference, as you say.
That's right. Yeah. I want to turn the question in one sense inside out and suggest that this aspiration that we have for unity, when unfulfilled, leads inevitably to a criticism of the church which is not unified. In the same fashion, I think, when we recognize our own intrinsic dysfunctions, it doesn't undermine the gospel. The gospel actually is about addressing our dysfunctions mercifully, graciously, in God's generosity. So I think that to speak about the church's unity, I'm more and more convinced that it is eschatological unity we are after, and not a present reality. And the reason I say that is because when present realities become the driving force in our projects and our aspirations of unity, inevitably we force others to become just like us, culturally, in terms of the traditions, the rhythms, and the like. So if we can keep our eyes, rather than thinking of unity as a structural, organizational issue, but a missional issue, as I say towards the middle of the book. And the mission is always aspirational. That is, we're aspiring to work towards unity, to overcome our division. But it is not, and here's a certain humility required to admit it, when we fail to achieve unity, it's not always a failure. That is, a husband that says to a wife says to a husband, we can be one if you're just like me. And I think the yearning for structural unity of the church has to be kind of reinterpreted. Now, I do think it's aspirational. That is, I think we ought to aspire, work towards it. And when we don't, when we simply go off into our corners and don't talk to those Baptists across the street or the charismatics or whatever, whoever it might be, woe unto us. However, a metaphor that I think goes back to C.S. Lewis, I've never been able to put my finger on it, but if you think of the church as a house with many rooms in it, somewhere in the house we have to find the room that we belong in, where we sleep, where we eat and the like. We can't always spend time in the hallway bumping into the different folks that live in this house. So, again, to expand that metaphor, when the criticisms that are lodged against the fragmentation of the church are built on the assumption that if we only did X, Y, or Z, we wouldn't be fragmented. You know, the overly simplistic answer is, if only we weren't sinful, but that's not the only part of it. I think the second part of it is, on this side of paradise anyway, God has wired us differently, and we ought to be able to respect those differences. So should that little village in southern Zimbabwe, or the house church in Shanghai, or a large mega church wherever, ought they to be structurally, organizationally under one umbrella? And I think that would be a disaster. I don't want to give up the hope that we have to work towards unity. I just want to be careful that we don't build into it assumptions of what that unity might look like.
Yeah, this kind of begs the question of the differences that make a difference. So we referred earlier to that church in Zimbabwe, and we were saying our intuition, our shared intuition, is that the length of a worship service, if it is something that is customary for all the people, and dozing off here and there for one or two of the sermons is not that much of a problem. If that's the way it's done there, it's not a difference that makes a difference. It's okay. We can be with these people. They're not doing something that crosses a fundamental boundary. But there are differences that make a difference. So we can say, as Trinitarian Christians, we would look at the Latter-day Saints religion and say, no, this is a perversion of Nicene Christianity. This actually takes us outside of the boundaries of the thing that is this fundamental about the house, right? We're not in the house anymore. We're out. And we could even zoom in and deal with some differences that are within Nicene Christianity that nonetheless somebody's right about and somebody's wrong about. So, infant baptism is a good example. Somebody's right about that and somebody's wrong about that. And ultimately, I guess in the eschatological end of things, God will set one of us right, or one group right on the subject, right? So how do we go about parsing those differences and do like, J. Gresham Machen did back with Christianity liberalism and say, okay, there are things that are fundamental and there are things that are not. And the Presbyterian church down the street that has the rainbow flag out front, right? And that is marrying men, they've crossed a line. They're no longer in the same house. How do we draw those lines?
Yeah, carefully. Great wisdom is required of it. I think leaning into the story of the church's boundaries across the ages will help us. It's not definitive. Machen and many others have said the church ought not claim anything that's not claimed across the scriptures. So the scriptures finally are the divine word that allow us, at least in part, as Paul says, to see those boundaries. Not fully, not exhaustively, and with great humility, or at least with a humble spirit that is nonetheless courageous, we hold on to boundaries. Now, it's an interesting discussion, maybe for another place, another time. The church has thought very differently about the very nature of boundaries, not what the boundaries are, but the nature of that conceptual question. And I think there is here a room for us to have discussion about how boundaries work with a church that embraces a center, namely Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection. There's the center that holds. Now, you can talk about it as a boundary marker, but I think you can also talk about it in a way in which it's the glue that holds us together. And so rather than thinking in just, we're using metaphors, obviously, of the church having a set of walls, a fortress-like mentality, and in parts it has to have those metaphorical walls. On the other hand, it also must emphasize there is a center, a glue that binds us together, and in part, not surely in whole, but in part, will overlap even with our secular friends. There are deep longings and yearnings that we see fulfilled in the gospel that might be ways to communicate. If we emphasize boundaries so far that they necessarily exclude always, I think that's dangerous. On the other hand, if there are no boundaries, no walls, and anything goes, pluralism becomes relativism. And there are so many arguments about the intrinsic unintelligibility of relativism. We don't even need to go there any longer. I mean, that point is so clear. On the other hand, practically, a lot of our friends and neighbors live in a deep relativism as they think about these questions.
Richard, it's very Augustinian of you, the way you bring out this restless yearning that our non-believing neighbors will have. And so, and this is one of the great problems with the secular synthesis, if you will, when it comes to diversity, because it thins out convictional life. It thins it and thins it and thins it until there's nothing left, until we have this sort of covenant that we're all going to sit around and sedate ourselves with entertainment and abuse drugs and watch porn in order to keep from having any convictions that are strong enough to create a war or drive us apart. These have been called like the weak gods, as opposed to the strong gods, which drove us apart in the middle of the 20th century and created these vast wars that claimed so many lives. And so the modern world is just scared to death of strong convictions. We need to sit around and have weak, thin, watered down convictions. But the problem is that leaves our neighbors with this yearning and this intuitive sense that there actually has to be more. That this can't be all there is. There has to be more to life than just entertaining myself and getting along and taking a paycheck. And that's where the real strength of pushing back from a Christian perspective lies, that we can point to that center you're talking about, that thing that holds us together, that Savior whom we orbit as satellites orbit a planet, kind of. That as you were talking, that was kind of the metaphor that came to my mind. It's like, what planet are we orbiting? Well, the Latter-day Saints would be orbiting the planet Kolob, I guess. But we're orbiting the planet Trinitarian God and Chalcedonian Jesus, right? And we all believe in him. That Jesus, fully God, fully man Jesus, that actually unites us around a conviction that's so strong, it can have a missional appeal to our secular neighbors who don't have anything that strong in their lives. They're all watered down and sad.
That's a really important point. And I think that challenge for us is to break the stereotypes that our secular neighbors and friends have of us, so that we can have the conversation with them about this deep yearning, longing that doesn't get filled in this, what Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame, where the only thing that matters are the things right in front of us temporally. And yet, to get to that point, we've got to somehow find a way through or around or over these stereotypes that our secular friends have of us who are religious. Religious folk in our time are bigoted, are narrow, are rigid, are unfriendly, are critical. On the list goes. And somehow we need to break that. Now, I think there is a kind of defense mechanism among secular folk that creates that stereotype. On the other hand, I think we too often give them that opportunity to stereotype us. In the chapter on the nature of our secular age, I cite John Rawls. And for Rawls and many other classic liberal theorists, the religious wars of the 17th century and the 18th century were defining of what religion is when left unfettered. That is, it creates violence. It creates exclusion of others. Now, I don't think we can live in the 20th century and suppose that the secular state has created a peaceful time and has done away with war and all those sorts of things, that left to our own devices, we will try to exclude others. Now, I think there's a lot of mythology that goes along with the religious wars. I think they were actually imperial wars, not religious wars. But, aside from that historical claim, we do have to bump into the stereotypes our friends have of us. And then I think we're allowed to speak into their lives. I've got a neighbor whose brother died of cancer early on, and she was a nominal Roman Catholic. I said, I'm never going back to church again because the problem of evil. But you have to engage somebody honestly to have that conversation. And if they think of you simply as somebody that's going to come and beat them over the head or, speak badly about them, you can't have that conversation of how to make sense of suffering. In an era which has no resources to make sense of suffering, we have something to say. It's not always easy. It's not always straightforward, but Christians have thought from the beginning that the death of Jesus gives us resources, conceptual resources, to talk about a God who identifies by grace and mercy with our sufferings. And in fact, on the cross, takes them to himself in some important sense. So I'm with you entirely. It is an Augustinian move that we think about the ways in which modern secular superficiality is not satisfying. And so, I love to look at commercials from the 1950s and then the movies in the 1960s that reflected back on those commercials. The post-war life was a life of convenience. That was the promise. We were going to have dishwashers. We were going to have vacuum cleaners. And then all of a sudden, this prophetic edge comes to movies talking about how artificial life was if that was the purpose of life. And I think there's some truth to that. That resonates deeply for us 50 or 60 years later as well.
Richard, I'm a big nature fanatic. I like to be outside as much as possible. And one of the things I notice when I look at the natural world is that it's just exploding with diversity, that there's diversity of form, shape, color, sound, lifestyle, design everywhere. And you can scarcely walk 3 inches in a forest and not see that incredible diversity, even in just among the trees and the shapes of the leaves and how they reproduce and what they smell like and what their bark looks like. That tells me that God has this deep love for diversity that we need to be very careful not to squish or I'm not just talking about the woods and stepping on bugs. I'm talking about worrying about the diversity we see among Christians, among the people of God, among the people who are brought in from every tribe, tongue, and nation to join Christ in and become united to him in the church, this growing organism, as Lewis calls it, the church. And I wonder if you can, as we get close to the end of our time here, I wonder if you can sort of sketch out a positive vision of what it looks like to integrate the diversity of the human family into this growing city of God, as Augustine would call it, that what it would look like to actually bring in, say, the different languages, the different customs, the different worship styles, the different markers of every people of the world into a unified whole. Cast that vision for us in a really compelling way that may even convince someone who is listening and says, Christianity is just a steamroller, it destroys cultural diversity.
And we need to take that kind of criticism seriously and answer it on its own terms. Just using that analogy of nature, it is an enormous sense of diversity that you confront. But we talk about ecosystems, the way in which that biodiversity functions organically, symbiotically to create a thriving environment. On the other hand, we're also aware of certain kinds of environmental crises that squash, not only squash the bug, but squash that biodiversity in such a fashion that you not only lose these, say, for example, the trees in the Amazon forest because of over logging it, but you therefore create disaster for other elements and aspects of that biodiversity. So I think the compelling picture, and you brought it up, I was going to bring it up, but you brought it up so nicely, that picture at the end of Revelation, that compelling picture of tribes and tongues. It's interesting language, and I think you see echoes of it all across the canon of how those normally divide us, but now, in some mysterious sense, call us together. And of course, the key claim at the end of the book of Revelation, as well as throughout the New Testament, is that worship of Jesus that binds us across our differences. And actually, we come to understand how remarkable this Jesus is, that he's worshiped in so many different languages, so many different cultures, so many different tongues, so many different tribes, so that the tribe or the tongue or the culture doesn't become its own end. It realizes the richness, the thickness of this Jesus that we worship. Benjamin Warfield, one of the old Princetonians, talked about mystery of why God in his providence gives us 4 gospels, not one, of Jesus. And he says it's like a symphony. It's because you hear so many diverse elements together that you're overwhelmed by it. So it is, I think, that the church that keeps its eyes on Jesus in his thickness, his richness, his depth, this remarkable reality of God in the flesh, so it is that the church will become reflective of the one we worship. That has been from the beginning. We will become like what we worship. And if the claim is not about us, it's about what we worship, that will reflect in our unity together. And therein is, I think, the danger of politics. We begin to worship a certain political policy. We begin to worship certain, I live in New England, and our wonderful sports rivalry with New York, it animates a lot of public conversation. That which we worship tells us about, that's obviously a trivial example, but you get the point, I think.
I always assume that sports rivalries are always half joking, or at least a third joking.
That's right.
Right.
They do touch deep on the sense of loyalty to something outside of ourselves that binds a community together. And so they are, I think, analogies, and we need to be careful that not all preacher analogies come from the world of sports. On the other hand, the world of sports, as many have said, is reflective of modern life in many ways.
I love as what we're doing now, even with the nature metaphor, and I guess to some extent the sports metaphor, is we're taking reality and we're striking it like a tuning fork or a wine glass or something, and the ring that results from it has a Christian tone to it. It's a Christian note, and that tells me on a really deep level, Richard, that the Christian story is the fulfillment of reality. That it's what Chesterton kind of argues this in Everlasting Man, that it actually fits the lock, to use another metaphor. It's like a key that fits the lock of reality. And when we look at this, is what happens in the Bible. Paul reaches for the human body as a metaphor for the church. And why? Because of the unity and diversity that's manifested in the body. And it's not accidental, because God made the body and God's making the church. So the body works together. It's one thing, but it's also different. It has diversity within the unity. And those two things are integrated in a beautiful, life-giving way. So yeah, I think you're right over the target here. I want to ask one last question here, because you zero in on wisdom. You don't give a very a tidy sort of cut and dry solution to the problem of unity and diversity in this book. And I think it would cheapen the book if you did attempt a very tidy solution. But you do zero in on this concept of wisdom and how we need wisdom to understand how to contextualize, how to manifest this principle in a diverse and confusing and divided, as the subtitle says, world. Talk to us about what you mean by wisdom and why it's so important.
Yeah, wisdom is so important, and in short supply in our time. I think it's in short supply in most ages. On the other hand, it is a gift that God has given us to navigate the tension, the stress, the symbiotic relationship between unity and diversity. So Proverbs, strange that you have a book of Proverbs in the canon, or that Jesus tells parables. And I think often the way we communicate wisdom is with stories or with proverbial sayings. Wisdom is not mechanical. It's not this grand treatise of how-tos. It is sometimes hard to put your finger on. I say the two fundamental characteristics of Christian wisdom is the conviction that because God has made the world, it is good. And because it is fallen, the world is bad. Holding those in tension is quite critical. And the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. And so wisdom pulls us out of our own knowledge base, out of that information. That just reminds me of the contrast with an information age like ours, a Google age. Wisdom discerns it, but it's hard to teach it. It's hard to find it. And yet I'm absolutely convinced that most of us, when we bump into it, we know it. One of the important differences is between wisdom and intelligence. In an era where we educate for intelligence and not wisdom, we see the results. And I think the results is that education itself, just to take that one avenue, becomes its own and its own credential, and you build your own reputation on that. Wisdom is always self-effacing. Wisdom doesn't draw attention to itself. The wise person looks upon the other and cares for the one in the room that needs to be cared for. And strange often to find it. You often associate wisdom with those who have suffered also, strangely, because what suffering does in some measure is restrain the hubris that if we only did the right things, we would not suffer. There is the great heresy of the prosperity gospel. In our age, in every age, I think, to turn the gospel into simply a transactional event that gets us what we want. Wisdom is so interesting. So Proverbs 26 talks about the wise one knows when to answer the fool and when not to answer the fool. And so there's no mechanical way. The proverb doesn't go on to say, here's what you look for. it just almost intuitively knows. So, a pastor that reckons with the differences between that person that comes into their office with deep sense of arrogance, you hit them hard because that's their nature. But a person that comes in with a very tender conscience, you don't whack them up the side of the head. You put your arm around them. Wisdom knows how to treat people differently in that regard. So you've got 4 children. We have 3 children. You know what? They're not all the same. And as a parent, I had to learn how to treat them differently while living in a culture that says everybody's to be treated the same. And so that is again, just a illustration or an analogy of this tension we're wrestling with of unity and diversity. And again, the reminder that this is, after all, the world that the Trinitarian God has made and in which we live and aspire to that final picture in Revelation.
Well, I love that. And I think it's such a great place to end the book because wisdom is this elusive concept, yet also personified in Jesus Christ himself, who knew how to answer difficult questions, who knew how to deal with tender consciences. And boy, did he know how to swat down arrogant ones. And, he's our exact model of exactly what you're talking about here looks like. Well, my guest today has been Richard Lints, author of Uncommon Unity, Wisdom for the Church in an Age of Division. Richard, thank you so much. I think this has been a really thought-provoking and helpful discussion.
I've enjoyed it immensely, Shane, and I really appreciate your work, and I hope and pray it continues on in lots of different ways.
Upstream is a program of the Colson Center. When it comes to the hardest questions we ask, we have thousands of years of accumulated wisdom from which to draw, from a faith that is the explanation of all reality. So come upstream and learn to understand the world, the church, and the God who has placed you in them. Connect with us on social media or find more resources at upstream.colsoncenter.org.